I'm Pat Telford. I'm actually William Pattison Telford VI, but that's a story for a longer session. And this is my compadre, Joel Yoker, first of his name.
And last, probably.
And last. And we were the technical leads for the early adopter program. So what is this early adopter program? We've been running for a little over a year now with a bunch of customers, primarily service providers, because they're the first and keenest interested adopters for Azure Stack. The first ones will be getting their hardware probably next week and starting to deploy. And we did a few things in this program to gather some insight from them that we'll be able to tease you with a little bit here. So our sort of 3 phases with these early adopters where we ran a remote workshop session, so a Skype call with them, where we would get them up to speed with what Azure Stack is, what it can do, the philosophy of what kind of workloads you'd run in there. And in turn, we'd talk to their business people about what their expectations or their hopes or desires were when they deploy Azure Stack. So we asked them a bunch of standard questions, and we have that aggregated data. We'll show you some of that today. With some of those customers, so of the 205 workshops that we did, we picked 42 customers that were at a good point, and we went out and visited them at their data center, and we did a deep dive over the course of a week, drilled down into all the technical aspects of Azure Stack, and we also got them deployed on a one-node Azure Stack system so they could get their hands on a keyboard and start kicking the tires. And 25 customers also came to us, to our data center in Redmond, and they got real experience with a real multi-node Azure Stack system from the vendor of their choice, HP, Dell, or Lenovo, and they would exercise it. They'd bring their workloads, they'd test how it integrated with their billing systems, et cetera. So we have a lot of good data points. Now, we've still been enrolling additional customers into this early adopter program, so we've probably hit about 500 members. They come from all across the world. At this point in time, we had 56 countries represented in our geography. And we've been running a series of events, a bunch of webcasts, and we had close to 1,000 people come to an airlift in Bellevue in the springtime this year, where we did a whole multi-day technical session with them. And the first couple teaser stats here are about 3/4 of these early adopter service providers, and a couple enterprises thrown in there, indicated that data sovereignty is a thing that's really driving them to use Azure Stack. So as an example, we had several customers in New Zealand, which might be surprising, but they all said their customer base is super interested in Azure, but they also like the feeling that their data could be kept in New Zealand, which isn't possible in the public Azure data centers because we don't have any there. So that's sort of a first interesting stat. And 44% of the service providers we interviewed also said that they would like to deploy not only VMs into Azure Stack, but would also like to consume some of the PaaS services, websites, logic apps, et cetera. Give the conch over to Joel here for a sec.
So we heard a lot of interesting things from these groups as we dove into what they did, and we interviewed them over and over again, spent a lot of time working with them, as Pat said. A couple key points that came out to us that we had, and these are the 2 kind of stats that stuck out in my mind. First is people said they wanted to go fast, right? They said, you know, the minute you release this, we're hoping we can get it out. In fact, you know, 3/4 of them said that aspirationally, they want to go ahead and get this out within the first 6 months and roll this out in their environment. We said, okay, that's interesting news. And we said, what are you using today? And they said, well, we're using a combination of some Red Hat over here. We're playing around. We have a large percentage of us are using VMware, hosting a lot of our things inside VMs. This is the platform they're using to host their solution. And that told us a couple of things. First is everybody wants to go really, really fast, right? Second is they're using something completely different than what we have. They're not using some of those public cloud constructs. And they may have some exposure to Azure, but a large percentage of what they're running on premises, using different tools, different processes, the workloads are very much bound to virtual machines. So when we talk about that kind of idea of people wanting to be able to move to PaaS, it means that there's a job to do. We need to upskill people very fast, and we need to start thinking about how we can start planning our environment moving forward.
So what's driving them from a business perspective to go to Azure Stack? So we asked a bunch of questions about this. Every single customer said that they want a public cloud type of platform, but they want it to meet all of their requirements, so all of their regulatory requirements. So having Azure in their own data center is super important, #1 driver. A number of them are interested in the DevOps infrastructure as code movement. So probably one of the most powerful capabilities of Azure Stack is to be able to take what we do in Azure with Azure Resource Manager templates, construct a whole solution with multiple servers, services, networking, and then deploy that into Azure in their data center. So this ARM template mobility from Azure to Azure Stack, killer feature. A few of the service providers said they might think about disconnected scenarios, so running Azure in a submarine or running Azure in an air-gapped network. It wasn't a primary driver, but they started thinking some of their customers might have an actual use case for this. And only a few, about 20%, said that their customers were prepared to start deploying modern applications. So using container services, some parts running in Azure and public cloud, some in Azure Stack, some in other legacy systems in their data center. So they can see the interest in that, but for the most part, their end users, their customers were not really ready for that. It would be lift and shift of existing applications or net new applications. And there are a few areas as we teased out and talked to them about the capabilities of Azure Stack that sprung to light as important for them. So the first one is developing hybrid applications. They can clearly see the desire to build some stuff in Azure, some in Azure Stack, using ARM templates. The whole ARM template infrastructure as code, building a solution once and being able to deploy it to Azure Stack or Azure, also very appealing. And then there are a few points where they know they have their work cut out for them. So one is integrating Azure Stack into their data center, networking it up, connecting to namespaces, identity, et cetera. Joel will talk about some of that in a minute. And key to service providers is billing. So connecting up the Azure Stack with its consumption model to their existing billing systems is important. Several of them tried this out in our data center with multi-node Azure Stack. And then a couple things are hard or need a lot of planning in Azure Stack for the service providers. They can't just plug and play. One of them is business continuity and disaster recovery. So they have in their VMware estates the ability to do backups of VMs at a whole VM level and restore them. In Azure Stack, their backup regime is going to have to be different. So they have a whole planning cycle around that, which they understand and need to get going on. And the other thing that's really hard with a new product like Azure Stack is service level. So they're thinking, I want to offer a service level to my end customers. I get how I do that in my data center today. I'm not sure what I should offer for Azure Stack. So there's no prior field experience, and that service level is shared between them in their data center, or you in your data center, your people, your staff, your procedures, the OEM vendor and their hardware quality, and Microsoft with the Azure Stack software and the consumption-based model. So a few things tough there. So Joel's now going to talk about what makes Azure Stack different from Azure.
So you probably, if many of you are using Azure, kind of raise your hands if you're playing with Azure, working with Azure today. Okay, good, fair percentage in the room. So you're probably familiar with it and watched a lot of the presentations this week about Azure. You understand how public cloud works, and you think, okay, Azure Stack is about bringing Azure to my data center. There's this level of consistency, but what does that mean? Is it different, right? And when you ask the first question, you say, well, Pat, does that mean all of Azure is on my data center and exists in there? I can just run everything in Azure Stack. And your answer would be,
hopefully, no.
Yeah, that's right. There's a subset of services. And then you start to look at what those, you start saying, are those services exactly the same as they run in Azure? And there's some differences there. So Azure Stack has three categories of differences when you think of services. So first, we're bringing a subset of those services down to Azure, right? And that subset of services down will grow over time. That initial offering, if you've watched any of the presentations around this, we have a set of services that we felt were core that we needed to release first. Those services have three primary differences, and that's a big takeaway if you're actually planning solutions on Azure Stack that will also run in Azure, or just purely trying to look at running those solutions on top of Azure Stack. First is the API version. So I think we've all grown up in a world where we have version X, and then we have version Y, and we have version Z, and we'll continue to kind of go down the alphabet or back and forth, through a set of incremental numbers of software that gets released in the market. API versions is how we actually are versioning software in the cloud, because we're moving at this cloud cadence. So all these new announcements that you've heard this week about different services, whether it's network, storage, maybe it's app service, all these new capabilities are incremented through an API version. So those API versions, once they're released in our primary regions, as they go to sovereign regions, they go to Azure Stack, it takes a while for those to be rolled out. Right? So when you look at the versions of the software that's running on Azure Stack, you need to pay attention to the API version. We have something called the template validator that goes out and looks for these types of things and says, hey, the version that you've referenced based on your ARM template that you've either downloaded or crafted for Azure and you're trying to run that on Azure Stack, you may need to increment that or change that to the version that actually works on top of Azure Stack. There's a very simple PowerShell command that you can run to go ahead and actually consume and figure out which ones those are, and we document those all on the web as well. But that was the first thing we kind of encountered. The second thing is scale. Right? When you think about the services we run in Azure, this is hyperscale, and I think everybody's seen these pictures of our data centers. We have hundreds of servers running in these large clusters, and these services that we have can enjoy this vast amount of compute power and storage power and network throughput. When we think about that on Azure Stack, we have to scale those services down to 4 servers. That's the smallest scale unit you can purchase. And actually, if you're using the ASDK, which Pat will talk about in a bit, the ASDK is a single server. So these services have to be scaled down to run in a very small infrastructure. And then, based on the hardware vendor that you use and the disks you purchase and potentially some of the options you have, you may have different scale points based on those scale units you have. So the services themselves, when you go out and look at those out on Azure.com and you're reading the documentation, they're giving you the information that's about the scale that we have inside Azure. So we bring those down on top of a stack where you make some decisions along with your hardware partner, and where this runs on a smaller set of nodes, a single-digit set of nodes versus hundreds of nodes, then you're going to see some differences. So there's, your limits are the same as you would expect. They're limited based on the capacity that you've purchased. So a lot of that is something that you need to think about when you're running these services out there. Last is dependencies. Just like any other IT system we have, services are dependent upon one another, and you may build solutions in your environment when you're building those and crafting them in Azure where you're using a wide range of services that are available. And as you bring them down, as I talked about it, there's a subset of services that we're bringing down incrementally onto Azure Stack. So you'll need to validate that those services, those resource providers are available for your solution. Again, we have a very simple tool to be able to do that comparison, and that's the template validator, and that's part of the Azure Stack toolset. I'm just going to use a very simple example, storage. I'm not going to read all of this to you. This is a slide that we use to kind of illustrate some of these differences that are out there, and I'm going to point out 3 things really quick. So first is, when we think about Azure Storage running on top of Azure Stack, this is the API version that we're using inside Azure Stack, and that will increment over time as we update those resource providers, but that's the kind of the version that's out there. So when you look at capabilities such as managed disks and other advanced capabilities they've announced this week, or potentially it's storage encryption, those capabilities will come later because they're based on the API version or the release that we've provided it in. Remember, I talked about that whole idea of scale. So we support LRS in our initial release, but if you think, well, are we supporting GRS? Well, with a single scale unit, right, scaling down that 4, we're not supporting that yet, right? So within a single region and a single scale unit, that support isn't available. So for today, the capability of that is specifically scaled to LRS. Last but not least is the idea that when we think about premium storage is backed on Azure by flash storage, right? And there's a lot of different characteristics to the type of flash storage we use based on the unit that you purchase, right? Whatever SKU you purchase out there, and you allocate that when you go out to our Azure portal. When you do that inside Azure Stack, we want to make sure that you're successful, that template that you're using, that you're going ahead and provisioning and you're calling premium storage, we're going to make sure at an API level that works. But the storage you purchase is based on what you're working with your hardware vendor on, right? We have some minimum specifications that are going to begin to advance and make modifications. They're going to differentiate, and one of the areas we expect they'll differentiate is storage performance. So what you see and what we give you in terms of capabilities inside Azure, again, we want those workloads to be able to run on top of Azure Stack, but they may not have the exact same performance characteristics that you see in those hyperscale data centers. So each of these services have a lot of these types of considerations. Many of them are documented, and we're starting to release a lot of that documentation this week out on our docs.microsoft.com. So you can go out and kind of see the considerations you need to think of for network, storage, app service, and other services that we're releasing on top of Azure Stack. So a couple other things we did is we dug in and we said, well, let's talk about, what are people trying to use, right? So with the range of services that we have, let's get a sense of what services people are expecting to use based on the solutions that they want to bring to market. And we asked them a number of different questions and dove into a number of different tests around these solutions as we brought them into Redmond. But one of the things that we found is that because a lot of those solutions are VMware, these kind of IaaS-related services became very popular very quick. We asked people to bring in their applications, to bring in their data, and to begin to transform and test these. They initially started with virtual machines. So they were very, very popular. But what we ended up seeing after day 3 in our testing was that we started to see kind of poking around and saying, can I take this web front end and be able to start surfacing it inside of app services? And as we dug in more with the business leaders, they said, while we want to have IaaS, and we believe that there's going to be a place for a long time for infrastructure as a service, this PaaS world is very interesting for us. It's driving our costs down. It's enabling kind of a wider range of services. These are services that we can't deploy on premises today. We can't provide without getting to Azure. So that's kind of a differentiating model for them based on what they have. So it's a way that they can kind of drive customers and drive their users to use a different level of services. So we have this conversation also a lot, and this was one of probably the most confusing conversations. And I'll reach, my friend came up earlier and was asking a very similar question before we started this, is this disconnected model and identity and billing, and how does this all work? So the thing to keep in mind is that connectivity models, right, disconnected and connected, are one category of changes. It's an option that you have. You also have identity choices. So we have a rich set of identity. We can support either on-premise Active Directory identities using ADFS, or we can use cloud-based identities using Azure Active Directory. We also have a billing construct, and we have pay-as-you-go, which provides kind of consumption-based service, and you begin to see kind of pay-as-you-go models around each one of these, much like you consume Azure. So if you're familiar with Azure billing, the idea is that it's the same kind of model, it's the same bill. The software is licensed by what you use. There's also a capacity model where you're able to go ahead and license by core and by service, and you can kind of buy out the platform. That's how we've been deploying software for a very long time and how we've been licensing it. So when you're in a disconnected model, what happens is those choices change. So those are a range of choices you have around identity and billing. When you move to disconnected, you remove some of those choices. When you're disconnected, you can no longer connect to Azure Active Directory. Therefore, you're not able to use that option. You have to use ADFS. When you're disconnected, you cannot use the billing model as pay-as-you-go. You have to buy out capacity because you're not connected to our commerce engine inside Azure, so we can therefore not give you metered activity based on use. So you do the capacity model. And kind of the lesson around this is we went and we were talking to different customers, and they said, this is great. We can't use Azure today because of various reasons. Maybe it's large data sets and adjacency for their applications. Maybe it's this data sovereignty and wanting to keep stuff on premises. And they assume a disconnected model. And for those who work in those environments, those organizations that are public sector that have, you've heard about these things like cruise ships and maritime operations and otherwise, they live in a world where disconnected is kind of a way of life. And it's a way of life that has a lot of trade-offs, right, between the types of applications and the connectivity models and being able to check and see how often we check certificates, all those types of things that would happen when you don't have connectivity to any type of infrastructure. So one of the things that we see is that just because we provide this capability, connected model doesn't necessarily mean that your data exists in the cloud. That hybrid model is a choice. And you can use that, both the billing models and both identity models in a connected infrastructure. And we think that's going to provide probably for most customers the best value and the best range of choice. So if you haven't started in a disconnected model, the idea is don't start today unless you have a very specific business reason to do so.
So Joel, from a strategy perspective, when we talk to these customers, what are we guiding them towards? So what should they think about?
Yeah, so the primary thing we think about is that if you are looking to have an extension of Azure in your environment today and you want to be able to take advantage of on-premises capabilities of Azure, you should start in that connected model. You should start with pay-as-you-go. You should use modern identities in the cloud and use Azure Active Directory. If you have a business reason where it needs to be disconnected, we have capabilities to be able to support that. It's just an option that you do, but you turn off other capabilities that you would have. So there's a couple things that we kind of wrapping up with this kind of some thoughts that if we had to summarize is first is IaaS should complement PaaS when it comes to Azure Stack. Azure Stack's value is in the platform-based services that we provide, all of these new services that you couldn't do before. So if you have highly virtualized environments, which most organizations do, you're running VMs and you're probably running them very well. But you need to think about how does that look kind of long term? What do you need to be able to run in combination with your platform-based services? And you can begin to transition those applications. The second thing is all these differences I've talked about. When you're going into building a solution, just don't go in assuming that all of this works exactly the way you've modeled it inside Azure. We have a lot of tools to be able to help you plan and test and develop your application. Pat's going to talk about some of those. But the idea is that you should begin by, as IT pros, people that are managing this infrastructure, start to understand the differences between those services so that you can guide your users, your developers in the right direction. And last is that if you're looking at taking your application and you want to start modernizing those apps, just by rolling out a system and saying, hey, please use this in my environment, that's not going to drive people to it. You need to start some of that modernization work. Find that first application in your environment that you think would be a good candidate that could benefit from some of these Azure services and start working with them immediately. There's a lot of options to be able to do so. So a couple things, when I talk about the urgency of starting now, there's a couple of things that we think are really important around this, and this is the things that we kind of discovered. Just waiting for the hardware to arrive and you're making that capital investment to be able to run Azure Stack in your environment. Once it arrives, by that point, you have a little bit of a crisis on your hands if you haven't started your planning journey. And we want you to start kind of immediately if you're even thinking about Azure Stack and you've gone to this and you've watched these different presentations, you think, this is what I need to be able to deploy in my environment. So first is that a lot of the infrastructure that people are using, they're using a lot of traditional SAN. You may have looked at some of those software-defined models, but this is a very different set of infrastructure out there. It gets patched differently, it gets managed differently, it gets carved up differently, right, from a software-defined model. So this difference of hyper-converged infrastructure that's running in your environment, the difference between our software-defined networking and software-defined storage being brought to you, all of the constructs inside Azure, there's a lot of change involved in that. So you need to be able to kind of embrace that and start thinking about what that does to your life cycle inside your data center. Second is how you compose workloads, and Pat talked a little bit about this, that the automation that you're using to build virtual machines and to build different applications and kind of surface those in your environment is going to change a bit unless you're doing a lot of work today in Azure, which is about half of you are doing some work now, so you're probably composing these using PowerShell, Azure CLI, or potentially using ARM for those. That's a big lift for the organization to start to retool some of those different solutions. So there's work that has to be done to bring everyone's skill set up. The way you manage workloads, what we found very kind of across the board, I would say, with our customers is everyone's managing from the host. They say, well, I have direct access to the host, and I'm going to go ahead and back everything up, and I'm going to manage everything from the host. I'm going to let the guest be the guest. And in some cases, there may be things like guest agents, but what we found is that's a lot different. Now, in Azure, you're managing everything from the guest. You're managing availability. You're taking advantage of basically backup and recovery, all of those types of solutions that you would do to provide compliance of your applications. All of that happens from the guest because you have no access to the host. Thinking about that same model on top of an on-premises infrastructure is a bit of a change, and Azure Stack's bringing that change along with it. So you need to think about how that's going to affect management, and because management are kind of table stakes when it comes to rolling anything out into production. And then last but not least is where rubber meets the road. If your organization that's in charge of operations cannot maintain the system is ultimately going to be something that's going to be a challenge for you to basically keep alive in production. So your operations teams need to be prepared. They need to be prepared for the changes to patch, update, to how they do field replacement units, how those different services would work inside the environment, maintaining the resource providers. Running Azure in your data center comes with a level of operational change. And it comes with a different cadence because we're releasing products at cloud cadence. So as we talked about those monthly updates in some of the sessions you might have been to, understanding how that works into your change control cycle is something you need to embrace early on.
So of course, now everybody's excited about Azure Stack. So how would you start? So here's how the service providers we worked with in the early adoption program started, and here's how you can start. So the first thing is, even if you have no Azure Stack accessible to you today, there is a policy template for Azure that limits what you can do in a subscription that has this template to only stuff that's available in Azure Stack. So it limits you to the API versions and the services and the VM sizes, everything that's available in Azure Stack. So if you want to start building a solution in Azure today that you know will go onto Azure Stack, apply this policy, away you go. So you can start this today, or I'll give you till tomorrow when you get home and you can start it tomorrow. The next step on the journey that all of our early adopters experimented with is this Azure Stack development kit. It's a one-node deployment of Azure Stack. So if you have a server with a relatively large amount of memory, you need at least 128 gig to run just the fabric. And to do anything productive with workloads on top, you probably need to close in on 200 gig of memory. A few locally attached disks. If you have a server like that, you can download the Azure Stack development kit and deploy it on one server in your environment. And then you can start experiencing it, setting up your trial tenants, putting workloads on it. And then obviously the ultimate solution is to get a multi-node Azure Stack instance, which you'll order through one of the OEMs. So today you can do the Azure with policy, build solutions that you know will go into Azure Stack. If you have a server sitting around, you can download the Azure Stack development kit and deploy it on that one server. And then once you're ready, you can order with your OEM. So those are the early stages to get you through to being able to deploy something in your data center on Azure. A very useful planning exercise that we've gone through with a number of the early adopters is to think about what services you're going to offer to your end users on Azure Stack. So to start this, the first stage is to think about what your end customers want. What are the solutions they would expect you to deploy? What would they be willing to buy from you or deploy on top of Azure Stack? So you can think about the services, the VMs, which PaaS services they might want. Any marketplace items that are available in Azure today, you want to make them available on Azure Stack, so you need to check if they're available for Azure Stack and see if there's any opportunities to develop hybrid applications with part in Azure Stack, part in Azure. So now in the back of your mind, you've got a set of services that your consumers are interested in. As Joel mentioned before, scale is not a problem in Azure, but it is a problem when you pay for the hardware yourself. So for these services, compute, storage, network, et cetera, you'll need to apply quotas, basically to make sure that your consumers, whoever's consuming the Azure Stack services, don't overflow your system, because you're going to start small. And the third step along here is to determine what you're going to offer to your customers. So you can combine plans into offers that have a quota that represents services that you can offer. So these are things you don't have to do in Azure. In Azure today, you just go up and there's a bunch of services and you pick which ones you want to consume. If it's your own hardware in your own data center with your own customers, you have a lot more dials to turn to decide what to offer them. So if you follow these three processes, it means in the back of your mind, you have to be thinking about exactly what your business model is for using Azure Stack. And you might think, oh, I'll do this later. Once I've got everything deployed, then I'll worry about the plans and subscriptions. But even doing this as a paper-based exercise makes you think about a lot of other things. As you're going along, you might think, ooh, they're going to want to back up the VMs. How am I going to implement that? And then you'll go off onto a little side discovery into your backup structure. Or, ooh, what if a disk fails? How am I going to maintain my service? Who's going to do the disk replacement? How do I work with the OEM? So a lot of questions will fall out of this exercise if you go through it. And there's an even more elaborate version of this exercise, which is if you want to decide to offer a service in Azure Stack to an end user and you're going to make them pay for it, either through chargeback in an enterprise or if you're a service provider through actual consumers out there paying for something, that needs a lot more data because you have to know how much the hardware is going to cost, how much the subscription for the services running are going to be charged from Microsoft, how long it takes to amortize that investment before you start making money, how much HVAC you have to pay for in your data center, how much is power, what are your processes, how many people do I need, all those sorts of things. So we've gone through this really detailed exercise a few times to calculate out how much each service that they want to offer, each offer they're making, should cost to the service provider's customers. So this is a really good way to get all the teams involved in the planning exercise for Azure Stack. And then you can think about putting workloads on top.
So this is one of the applications that we had a conversation with our customers when they came into our hackathons, and we started just kind of talking through. We had a whole number of customers come through. As Pat said, 25 of them ran through. This is a very simple model that they had. They take a lot of data sets from a lot of different locations in this application. They take it, they go ahead and they drop all that data down into a big aggregate database, and they begin to do work on it. First, they have to churn all of the data into an infrastructure. Then they have to then go ahead and shard that data out so that it's available in different data sets that are available to different consumers of that aggregated data. So there's a little bit of work that they have to do to kind of get this data available to all of these different formats and all of these different groups. But essentially, this is a very common pipeline that we saw. In fact, I had a conversation with a customer that came by in the expo, and they had the exact same scenario for their environment. And like a lot of these solutions, they built this solution based on virtual machines. They went ahead and they created a series of virtual machines. They handed it over to their developers, and they said, build your applications. And you are not just a developer now. You are now the sysadmin of all of these different systems.
I didn't even know I was a developer.
That's right. Well, and you've just been promoted. So the other problem that they had was all of these different systems had to run all the time. Right? So they said, how do we kind of drive costs down? Because these are very, very large systems that we're running. They're trying to do, but some of them are just doing a little bit of work at any given time based on a set of triggers, based on a set of events that would happen, or based on a different type of data that comes in they need to go ahead and run. So they wanted to be able to take this and run this on top of Azure Stack. As we started to sit there and look through, we started to break and tease that apart into the different systems that had. So kind of as an example, a lot of these organizations are looking at kind of refactoring these apps and looking at different services. And they said, well, I've got a front end. Well, that front end could probably run in web apps because it's a .NET MVC app. It's going to go ahead and work just fine. I've tested it in Azure. That should work just well. Looking at some of the different services they have, they said we can probably break this up and start running some of these capabilities inside Service Fabric. Taking those things that are event-driven and looking at those and saying, how do we run those inside Azure Functions? And taking advantage of some of these new capabilities that exist inside storage. And then for some of the data, they need to be able to go ahead and transfer and use that inside Azure. So having kind of a hybrid app so they can go ahead and move some of that data in where we can take advantage of hyperscale services, they're able to do. And it kind of made them rethink how their application worked. So kind of taking a step back, moving, many of you probably have an application that does something very similar. We have applications built on top of virtual machines. Re-envisioning those on top of Azure services and using some of these platform-based services so you're not licensing every agent on every VM that you're chasing down every Patch Tuesday to see whether or not they're compliant in your environment, and making sure things are up to date and making sure that everybody's configuration is up to par is something that organizations are struggling with. So these platform-based services are really changing that in Azure, and bringing those down on premises is something that you now have the capability to do. So another thing is there's a lot of planning topics that we bump into, and I wanted to just kind of lightly cover the ones that we felt. So when you're going out and deploying Azure Stack, we think there's 5 main areas that you need to focus on. The number one area is identity. It's one of those early choices that you need to make. There's a lot of things that you can decide along the way, but identity is a choice that you need to be able to start thinking about immediately. And it's typically a different team in your organization that now manages that. It used to be, that all of these were the all-in-one systems, but now we've seen a lot of segmentation in the workforce. So going out and talking to your teams, understanding whether you're going to use a cloud-based identity and use Azure Active Directory for both your applications and also so users can come in and actually consume services off Azure Stack. That's important, or if there's a requirement for any reason that you use your existing Active Directory environment and you're simply going to federate that with ADFS. The next part is regulatory compliance. Now, if you've gone to the Azure Stack security session, you heard that we're basically doing third-party validation of the settings and the configurations. I talked about this being kind of a sealed host, and that we're doing a lot of the configurations end-to-end from the top of rack switches all the way down to every host and every setting that you could possibly imagine as part of the deployment. So when we do that, there's a whole series of activities that you need to do for people and process. And there's activities that you need to ensure to maintain availability, and the list honestly goes on. So if you're any of those organizations that talk about being in a highly regulated environment, of which we heard that it was almost 3/4 of our customers were doing that, you're very familiar with the process that this needs to start very early. And that process can start well before you actually receive the hardware in your environment. How you charge back for this is another key area. If you're not familiar with consumption-based billing, if you're used to purchasing at capacity where you buy a license and you open the box and you deploy that on top of this whole metered set of software coming in is a bit of a jolt to the budget, right? Organizations have to understand what your consumption is, and you have to do consumption-based planning, and you have to think about what that billing model is going to look like, not just at the onset, but over time. And being able to do cost optimization is the other area, and that's probably why a lot of organizations are looking at solutions like this. So that's a big challenge, understanding how billing information is brought in, understanding how billing is surfaced, and understanding how you can use both the billing that Microsoft gives you for the services you use, but also those administrative meters that we provide you, which is the ability to see what services are being used or what's being consumed on your stack that you can then charge back or show back to your organization, that can kind of provide that holistic bill, if you will. Networking, as long as I've been in IT, has always been something that you need to plan. It's always been fairly complex. We've tried to simplify it as much as possible, but if you've gone to Thomas Rottinger's session and others, there's a whole series of networks that we need to be able to provide BMC communications, to provide tenant communications, to provide internal communications, and there's some planning that goes into that. Now, we've made it really simple. We've given you a set of ranges that you need to identify, but typically it's something that needs to happen up front, and then understanding who's connecting and how they're connecting to the system is also important. Sizing, I think that's kind of the last piece as we talked about it. Think about what that long-term use is. What does that capacity look like? Much like your existing systems, you could go ahead and fill a lot of those virtualization systems up until they tip over and say, well, we'll back off a little bit. Azure Stack has that fixed capacity, just like Azure, right? You're able to go ahead and kind of identify when you're reaching capacity and then begin to order more from your hardware partner. It's the exact same model here. We think about that from a planning perspective. What is your next year of consumption going to look like, right? Begin to do your sizing from that perspective, also the sizing of those applications to see if those services that we talked about are sized appropriately to run on an Azure Stack instance versus something that runs maybe in Azure as hyperscale.
And a few of those things, if you get them wrong right out of the gate, they're going to come back to haunt you. So if you get your networking, subnetting wrong for your first deployment, that probably means you're going to have to redeploy because all the fabric has been addressed. If you get your identity choice wrong, you're going to have to go back and set yourself up to use Azure Active Directory instead of ADFS. But some of the things you can tweak, like your billing model, you can fix that over time. Yeah. Capacity, you just need to plan for it. So we're at the point now with the first early adopters where they're ready to go. They're waiting for their hardware to be delivered. As I said, I think the first ones are coming in next week. And they'll start to deploy across the 3 initial launch vendors, HP, Dell, and Lenovo, within the next month and up to the end of this fiscal year. So we're going to have some real-world experience of Azure Stack next time you see us. But for you, you can start to go now too. So a few recommendations. The first one is use that Azure Stack policy module for Azure so that you can build some trial solutions that you can feel confident will run inside Azure Stack. There are also a community of developed solutions for workloads that are out there today. So if you go to azure.microsoft.com, we have some templates to get you started with workloads that will run in Azure Stack. And on GitHub, there are a bunch of ground-up community-built templates, ARM templates, that also can be used in Azure Stack. So those are some really excellent and simple ways to get started with your own Azure Stack journey. And Joel, why don't you tell them about the white paper?
Yeah, so we have a white paper that's coming out. So we've worked with a number of seeded hardware program customers that we've been running with for probably the last year, and also in EAI. We learned a lot, so a lot of the stuff that we've kind of breezed over. We've got a kind of a rich white paper coming out. Around the end of next week, you'll see that online on Azure.com architecture or Azure.com white papers as well. And this just kind of summarizes a lot of these different pieces, but provides a little bit more detail as to what we've talked about and what we've learned, to give you just the lessons that we've had over the last year and make sure you can kind of think about what it took for us to actually run a program like this, what you can do from a planning perspective, and what are some of the things that you can expect in your journey towards Azure Stack. So that'll be out next week, and it really kind of gears towards, how do you kind of build that validation, that end-to-end validation environment on ASDK and start working through these planning exercises? Because the Azure Stack Development Kit, in my mind, is the hidden gem, and it's ultimately what allows everyone to experience Azure Stack prior to making that large capital investment that you're going to make as part of your journey.
And we've seen the general documentation on Azure Stack appearing pretty rapidly across Azure.
Absolutely, it's being refreshed as we speak, and will continue to be updated as just like our Azure documentation is. So we're kind of at the end of time. We appreciate you spending your morning with us. One thing, we're not really sure where this is all going to go, right? We have a lot of ideas as to where we think customers are doing. We have a lot of experience with what we've seen over the last year and a half with our customers. But now that it's out in the wild and it's been released and we're starting to see some of those deployments, we're going to see a lot of interesting patterns come up. We're going to see a lot of interesting solutions. And obviously, we want to hear from you. And we had a link earlier. The product group is very interested in paying attention to all those forums and really trying to see what problems you're running into, what problems you're trying to solve, and where you need the most help from a planning perspective, because I think we all want everyone to be successful in this journey. Now, we're at the end of the week, so a lot of these sessions are over, but if you kind of saw some things, you said, boy, that identity infrastructure is interesting, or I'm really kind of interested in security, or this whole, I'm in charge of billing and trying to get that charge back. I want to understand what that looks like. I encourage you to go out and review these sessions, and many of these sessions are recorded, so you'll be able to go out and look at these as part of the conference, but we've provided a little bit of a kind of a screenshot to give you a sense of what Azure Stack sessions are out there. So all of these areas we covered, the product group has gone a little bit deeper. We're going to stick around for a little bit of Q&A afterwards as the room begins to clear. But if you liked what we had to say, and if you want to be able to provide us feedback, if there's information you wanted to hear more about, please let us know. We'd encourage you to kind of get a survey on there. So thanks for spending the last hour with us.
Thanks, everyone.